I'll kick it off. Welcome, everyone. It is a privilege to be opening for the very first panel of the American Identity Summits, the Fight Against Censorship and the Future of American Journalism. It's going to be a great panel. We have 4 phenomenal guests. So obviously, today's general theme for, as Chris alluded to, is going to be, what does it mean to be American in this moment? And so I think free speech as a major component is of the American identity, and so hopefully we get a really, really good discussion on that, because I think it's a critical issue right now, unfortunately. Wish it wasn't, but. So my name is Kellen Ryle. I am a 4th-year PhD student in genetics, so I'm a little out of sorts here in kind of the political realm, but it's been really enjoyable kind of getting, learning a diverse skill set, getting introduced to a new world. I'm also a co-chair for the Student Advisory Board of the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression, a group on campus dedicated to free speech, or promoting free speech on campus and more broadly. So I encourage you all to check that out. Sorry for the plug. Anyway, so to introduce our panelists, we first here have Cenk Uygur. He's the co-founder and host of the Young Turks, which is the largest online news show in the world. He is a progressive commentator, known for his bold, unfiltered takes. He's a former attorney turned media entrepreneur. He built the Young Turks basically from the ground up. He co-founded the Justice Democrats and ran for Congress in California in 2020. He's a major online force in the world of online media, and we really appreciate his grassroots political activism. Our second speaker is Nadine Strossen. She's the former president of the ACLU, served from 1991 to 2008. She's a professor emerita at New York Law School and a respected legal scholar. She is the author of Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with free speech, not censorship. And she's one of the most dedicated defenders of free speech that we have here today. She's also a longtime collaborator with our next speaker, Jonathan Turley. Jonathan Turley is a professor of law at George Washington University. He's a leading voice on constitutional law. He's also a University of Chicago alumni, which is so phenomenal to have him back. He is the author of The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in the Age of Rage, which has been praised by Nadine as magnum opus. And he's widely known for his sharp legal commentary and public advocacy on free expression. And then lastly, we have Clay Travis. Clay Travis is the host of, I'm so sorry.
Clay and Buck's show, which is humbly named partly after me. And then we run Outkick, which if you haven't been, you should go right now, outkick.com. It's the only sane voice for sports in America, I think, today. So hopefully you all are checking it out on a regular basis.
I appreciate it, Clay. Thank
you. Yeah, no worries.
All right, yes, let's get the panel started. Thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for silence your phones. That'd be great.
Well, thank you, folks. Again, we're going to get started. Typically for these panels, we're going to have the moderator give short opening remarks and then have each individual panelist give 3 to 5 minutes of opening remarks, what they believe on these issues. I've spoken enough, so I will allow us to just take it to the panelists. So Nadine, I'd like to hear from you.
Oh, okay. So I was told we have about 3 or 4 minutes, which isn't very much to address fundamental questions, but I wanted to start in light of the fact of the recent death of David Souter, who was a personal friend of mine and a great friend to free speech and open inquiry. So I thought it would be appropriate to remind people of his legacy and how he served as a role model in ways that might not be as well known as some of us would like. I think it is fairly well known that he embodied independent thinking and critical inquiry. Independence of the politicians who nominated him, who campaigned for his appointment, and this is a quality that is not only aimed for in the Constitution, but is critically important, especially now, as we see a huge, if not unprecedented, host of actions by the executive branch of government that are challenging and violating, I would say, constitutional principles. We really depend on an independent judiciary. In terms of open-mindedness and being willing to re-examine on a public record and admit that you might be wrong about important issues, including First Amendment free speech principles, I think Souter was a too rare role model. You talked about these important qualities, Christopher, and how unfortunately rare they are. So, and he had a wonderful, modest, self-deprecatory sense. So I'll give you just one example. In 1991, which was his very first year on the Supreme Court, and he's often said that, and kind of apologetically, he didn't know as much then, newly appointed to the court, as he came to learn later on. In a case that the ACLU brought, and unfortunately the Supreme Court came out the wrong way. I'm fond of saying the ACLU never loses a case, it's just sometimes the courts rule the wrong way. And this was one where the courts ruled the wrong way on a type of expression that is perennially unpopular in our country, all across the political spectrum, and that is sexually oriented expression, right? Conservatives tend to hate it because it's antithetical to traditional family values, and progressives and radical feminists hate it because it's supposedly antithetical to feminism. So not surprisingly, the Supreme Court ruled the wrong way in that case, a case involving nude dancing. 9 years later, there was another such case, and the Supreme Court again came out the wrong way, but this time, Souter dissented. And he repudiated his prior vote 9 years earlier in a very charming way. He said, in the 9 years, I haven't learned any more about nude dancing, but I have learned a lot more about the First Amendment and free speech. And I just want to read you part of what he went on to say, because I think we should all take it as an invitation to re-examine and not be embarrassed. I think we should be proud if we change our minds. He said, I've come to believe that a government must toe the mark more carefully than I first insisted. I hope it is enlightenment on my part and acceptable even if a little late. He went on to become such a strong supporter of free speech that often he was in the dissent, a minority upholding free speech, and sometimes even the only dissenter. And here I'm going to mention one example, because it is a precedent that is extremely relevant today as we see the government wielding, and I would say abusing, the power of imposing conditions on grants of federal funding to pressure, if not coerce, violations of fundamental free speech rights by universities, by law firms, by other civil society institutions. And this was the case involving the National Endowment for the Arts, which the ACLU represented for feminist and LGBTQ artists who were expressing politically controversial points of view and denied NEA funding specifically for that reason, not because of lack of artistic merit. Again, the Supreme Court as a whole made a mistake, but Souter dissented in a very important piece of reasoning about how, although you have no right, no entitlement to government funding in the first place, the government may not condition that funding on insisting that you either not express certain viewpoints, or worse yet, that you must express certain viewpoints. And that is exactly one of the speech violative patterns that we're seeing from the current administration. So I'm sure I've butted up against my 3 to 4 minutes. Let's keep his model in mind, both on the substantive First Amendment issues and on the importance of an independent judiciary to enforce those principles, even indeed especially when they're politically unpopular.
Thank you. Jonathan, we'll go to you next.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back at my alma mater and to have met so many Chicago students. You're remarkably more well-rounded than we were when I was here. But it's also a pleasure to be here with my friends to talk about free speech and the free press. My book, The Indispensable Right, talks a great deal about the free press, and there's my second book, which is a continuation of that, also by Simon & Schuster, is coming out in a couple of months. It's really, they're holding it for the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, but it's called Rage and the Republic, The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution. And the two books talk about how free speech and the free press really were the most revolutionary moments of the American Revolution. People don't still have any inkling of how revolutionary it was, because in Great Britain, neither of those rights were particularly well protected. They still aren't. And this sort of came out of the head of Zeus. I mean, it was an amazing statement. When you look at the language of the First Amendment, no one had ever written anything like that before, and they still don't. And the book sort of traced that. The book that's coming out, Rage and the Republic, actually uses Thomas Paine as the spine that first looks backwards for half of the book at what the American democracy is and was, and then the second half looks at whether the American democracy can survive in the 21st century. But it uses Paine because he was one of the few figures that played a role in both the American and French revolutions. But Paine is also very relevant to where we are in the media. I'm surprised where we are. I've worked for CBS, NBC, BBC, Fox for 30 years as a legal analyst. I would never have imagined we could be where we are now in the American media. But in some ways it's familiar, because we began with people like Thomas Paine, who was a pamphleteer. We began with advocacy journalism. It's always been part of the American Republic. Then we embraced professional journalism with Pulitzer and the establishment of Jay schools. Then we also went through that period of yellow journalism that actually preceded the establishment of schools like the Columbia School of Journalism. And now we're in a period that you can call echo journalism and advocacy journalism. And it's having an impact because the media did play a role in furthering the censorship that we saw in the last few years. I just spoke at the Library of Congress. I had the honor of being the speaker at the awards ceremony there for media. And I did tell all of my friends in the media, many of whom I've worked for and with in all the networks, that we have become a happy ship of fools. Revenues and readership are plummeting. People are turning to social media and new media, and we don't have a clue. We don't even seem to have any interest in why this is happening. But there are a lot of indications why it's happening. The public is rejecting us. As the new editor of the Washington Post told his staff not long ago when he was brought in to try to stop the slide at the Post, he said, quote, "Nobody's reading your stuff. And we're increasingly writing for ourselves." And we have to look at that, because Let's Go Brandon was not a criticism of Joe Biden. It was a criticism of the United States media. It was using the words of the media against it. They were Yankee doodling American media. And we have to come to grips with that and what it means for this country. So thank you for having me here today.
Cenk, let's hear from you.
Thank you. So I can't stand tribalism and radicalism. And I'm going to challenge all of you here today, both in the audience and in the panel, to try to put it aside. And if you think, oh, yeah, I'm not tribal, well, let's find out in a minute. So how can I lay claim to not being tribal myself? We're clearly on the left, and proudly so. You have to have certain principles, and you have to stick with those principles no matter who's in charge, the Democrat or Republican, your side or the other side. And you have to be wary of authoritarianism no matter where it comes from. Jonathan and I were just at the World Forum in Berlin, and lots of warnings from all over the world, Turkey, Russia, Hungary, on and on and on, about what authoritarian governments do. And the first two targets are always the courts and the media. So if you stop listening to the courts and you shut down speech against you, we're on a disastrous path if that happens. So now, have I been true to my principles? Well, so let's talk about due process for a second before we get to the main event, which is free speech tonight or today. So due process, when Barack Obama murdered an American citizen without due process, Anwar al-Awlaki, we didn't call it out later, we called it out then. We said this is nonsense. This is crazy talk. And Attorney General Eric Holder should be immediately fired for saying that due process is not judicial process. It most certainly is judicial process. You can't murder an American citizen without going to the courts. And so they say, well, he was...
May I say something? He made that point in a talk here at the University of Chicago, interestingly enough.
Yeah, and he gave the speech at my graduation at Columbia, and I'm now embarrassed that happened. So that was, and then by the way, if you don't know, then they murdered Awlaki's 16-year-old son in a separate bombing, which they claimed was an accident. And then they murdered his 8-year-old daughter in a separate incident, which they claimed was a further accident, okay? No asking of the courts for any of that. And if you're a Democrat who defends that, you don't actually believe in due process. And when Trump is trampling on due process now, you don't really have a leg to stand on, okay? But we do at the Young Turks, because we've been calling out both sides. I've been canceled by the left, the right, and mainstream media. There isn't anybody who hasn't canceled me because we are honest. So now let's turn to Trump on due process. And what is he doing? So yesterday, Stephen Miller says, rid of habeas corpus. What do we need Western civilization for? Okay, let's just trash it. Oh, due process, what do we need due process for? Let's just trash it. So this government is 100% against the Constitution, and I loathe their attacks on Western civilization. I love America. I love our Constitution. I love Western civilization, and I can't stand the attacks on it from either Obama, Biden, or Donald Trump. And if you think that Donald Trump isn't doing it, you're in la-la land. When you say we'd like to take away the writ of habeas corpus, you are definitely attacking the Constitution, and you are definitely attacking Western civilization. That is a cornerstone. And by the way, if you're a conservative, and now you say, who cares about due process of the Constitution, you're not really a conservative. You're just a Trump fan. That's a different thing, okay? So now let's talk about freedom of speech, because my freedom of speech has been, there's been efforts to curtail it from every corner, right? So did the Democrats and the left wing do cancel culture? Of course they did. Saying that they didn't is absurd. It's absurd. You got canceled for every little thing. I got canceled for a blog I wrote in the 1990s, okay, on a joke I did about myself. They're like, well, we don't like your jokes, so we are canceled, okay. Yeah, and they canceled everyone until they had no voters left and they lost the popular vote, right? So now if you call out the left on its hypocrisy, some folks on the left get supernova mad. You're not allowed to disagree with anything on the left. And we're for freedom of speech. Are you? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't say you're not allowed to disagree with me and I'm in favor of freedom of speech. Those are totally inconsistent, okay? So now let's go to the Trump administration. 60 Minutes edited me wrong. It wasn't even me, it was Kamala Harris. I'm gonna sue them for $10 billion. I'm gonna block their merger because they were mean to me. The President of the United States? Get out of here, man. Don't tell me you were for freedom of speech. Donald Trump is 100% not for freedom of speech. The minute you criticize him, take away their license. What happened to freedom of speech? What happened to cancel culture? Canceling somebody's license to air a broadcast is definitely cancel culture. Okay, if you think that's bad, all right, how about snatching up people off the streets of America because they wrote an editorial against a different country? Okay, oh, you offended Israel. Take away her freedom of speech. And by the way, as Jonathan, let's see, I hope, as he can attest to, the Supreme Court has said for 200 years that freedom of speech applies to everyone in America, not just citizens. So if you take it away from non-citizens, hold on. If you take it away from non-citizens, then you're also taking it away from citizens. So it is a disastrous idea, and it's not even for our government. You've criticized Israel. Wow, big deal. Who cares, right? And so you're going to kidnap people, stuff them in a jail in Louisiana, and maybe deport them? I believe arresting someone is definitely cancel culture. Deporting them from the country is definitely cancel culture. So I can go on and on because Trump hates freedom of speech, despises it. And by the way, so do both sides, and so does the mainstream media. So I'll end on the mainstream media. Maybe we get consensus on that. So these guys, hey, Wuhan lab is right next to where the virus broke out. Could it be possibly that the virus came from a virus lab right next to where the virus came from? Okay, no, you're canceled. You're not allowed to say that. What do you mean I'm not allowed to say? What is this, right? And so, I've been smeared by mainstream media so many times, it's exhausting, right? So, and whenever I say something that they don't agree with, whether it's left or right, as you could tell, I've got plenty of criticism for all sides. When they agree with me, oh, speak away, yeah, preach, amen, right? When they disagree with me, cancel them, no way, she shouldn't be allowed to say that. Okay, so do you know that I'm banned on CNN and MSNBC and Fox News? Apparently, I'm the most dangerous man in America because I believe I'm the only person banned on all 3 cable networks. And why? I started a wing of the Democratic Party. We believe, and we can prove that it's the largest, but certainly one of the largest media networks online, let alone the whole country. So you're going to shut down that voice? Yes. He does not give sanctioned speech. He shall not be allowed on our air. By the way, can you believe that Donald Trump is shutting down speech? So wait, CNN, MSNBC, you can't shut down speech and then complain about Donald Trump shutting down speech. So can we be principled? For God's sake, I'm asking all of us, please, can we be principled about cherished American principles like freedom of speech and due process? I think it's a humble ask, but it's been a difficult ask in both administrations.
Thank you.
My name is Clay Travis. We host, Buck Sexton and I do, the biggest radio show basically in the country, 550 AM FM stations, all 50 states. I run Outkick.com, founded it, sold it to Fox in 2021. I am banned on ESPN and CNN. Some of you probably have seen the clip, and I'll address directly to YouTube here. If you haven't, you'll probably be entertained. But a lot of you out there may have seen this. In 2017, I went on CNN to defend free speech. There was a controversy over an ESPN commentator named Jamel Hill called President Trump a white supremacist. And the question was, should ESPN take action against her in the first Trump term? I went on to say no, that they should not, that everybody should have the right, especially not on the airwaves, to say whatever they think, whether I agreed or disagreed with it. And I said that I believed in only 2 things completely. The First Amendment, which is something that I think most people here on the panel and most of you in this audience, most of you on YouTube would theoretically support, and boobs, which is a clip that went viral because the female host was very offended that I would say that. And she immediately demanded an on-air apology. And to the point, it was the #1 story in America in 2017, and they tried to cancel me and say that I couldn't have opinions on sports because I had the audacity to say that on television and stand behind it. Now, I've been saying it for years because if you say you're a First Amendment absolutist, it kind of goes over everybody's head. They don't understand it. When you pair it with boobs, it makes people pay attention. And so it was a phrase that immediately drew that attention. And also then when you try to censor it, it draws even more attention, went viral. And that's probably one reason that I'm here today. But a lot of you are college aged. And what I would challenge you, and I would challenge you certainly everybody who's watching us right now on YouTube, because you're probably skewing much younger than anywhere else, be open to the idea that you're wrong. It's something that I think is the single most important thing that an intelligent person in America and around the world today can acknowledge. Be open to the idea that you could be wrong about something. If you can present to me data objectively in an argument that I am wrong, I will change my mind. I have changed my mind throughout the entirety of my adult life. That doesn't mean that you're not committed to underlying principles. It means that you are an intelligent, rational adult. I would submit to you that the biggest challenge that America has today is only about 5 or 10% of the American public, however you vote or whatever your political allegiance, is willing to consider the idea that they might be wrong. His example he just gave. How many people who would not accept that COVID could have come from a Chinese lab have later, because they said it was from a wet market, which, by the way, if you were going to argue that something was racist, what is more racist? China is so unbelievably dirty that they just eat anything in a wet lab, wet market, and they were able somehow to get COVID from pangolins or whatever the heck they were trying to argue. Think about this. Or they were advanced in a laboratory trying to figure out how to clone new viruses, create new viruses, and it managed to escape. If you were going to put on the racist, line of demarcation, which of these is more racist? Chinese people are so unsanitary that they will eat anything and viruses spread like crazy as a result from their wet markets, or, hey, they had an error and it got outside of a lab. Wouldn't you think the lab error was a lot less racist? Yet the New York Times top writers decided to label the idea that a virus could have come out of COVID as racist. Why did they do that? Because if they can attack the underlying concept as racist, as sexist, as homophobic, as transphobic, they don't actually have to go to the essence of the argument. Which is why I would challenge all of you. I think this is so incredibly important. I give credit to the University of Chicago and every institution out there that is actually committed to the idea that people can disagree and that something that someone might say might challenge your delicate emotions or make you a little bit uncomfortable. I would submit to you that almost the entire purpose of going to a university in this day and age is to be uncomfortable with ideas, to challenge the ideas that you entered with. And I will say from my own perspective, some of you may know this, I used to work in Democrat politics. I worked on Al Gore's 2000 presidential election in my home state of Tennessee. I was willing and putting forth my labor, which is one of the things I think that you're most connected to, your time. What are you willing to give your time to, your effort to? And by 2020, I was a diehard Trump supporter. I was ecstatic to vote for Trump in 2024. I think that I have not changed at all. I think that I have basically stayed in terms of my commitment to principles on the First Amendment, the same place that I was for most of my adult life. But I think everything has shifted. Some of you may have seen that graph that Elon Musk shared where he said, this is me, a little bit left of center. And then the Democrat Party went so far left wing that I became a right winger. I don't think that I have changed in terms of the principles of what I believe. We'll have a discussion about that. But I think it's important for all of you to find principles that you believe in and understand that the parties are constantly shifting around you. And that what might be considered a Democrat opinion right now as we sit and talk with you in 2025, 20 years from now in 2045 might be seen as a Republican position. And that's because the parties are constantly shifting. And if you're always standing behind one party, I think you're wrong. I don't like saying I'm committed to one party or the other because I've seen the parties change so much over the last generation that I think you have to be willing to move and adjust as you age. And again, my challenge to all of you, particularly those of you who are super young, because I think it's incredibly important, is be open to the idea that you're wrong. Be willing to consider the best arguments of the other side. I don't think it's a coincidence that I believe all four of us have law degrees. I think the most beneficial thing that you can gain from law school, I don't know if these guys would agree, is being able to analyze every side of all arguments so that you can make the case for something that you might disagree with better than the person that you would disagree with. And I'm sure if you watch television news, I've always thought it would be fun if you pushed a bell to really have rigorous thought to make the guys flip and argue the other side. Because I think that would be the true test of a great intellect. If on the spot you could flip and argue the other side, it means you've considered the full range of ideas. I feel incredibly fortunate now because instead of having to work for morons who pay me a lot of money as a lawyer, oftentimes lawyers will tell you the worst thing about being a lawyer is the clients sometimes you have to represent. When you're your own client, it's a pretty good feeling. I feel like I can look at every argument and make what I consider to be the best side of that argument, which I think most of these panelists would agree with as well. But that should be something that you think about. Not only do I agree with this guy or this gal, but do I think they could argue the other side as well as they're arguing the one they do? That's when you know truly they've considered the full spectrum of the argument. I may have gone way over, but this is a great event. Let's dive in.
Could I follow up with specific examples of how essential it is to be neutral in the application of constitutional principles and applying them to various governmental actions that are really relevant right now? So now we are seeing a lot of liberals and people on the left end of the political spectrum objecting to the enforcement of an anti-discrimination statute on campus, namely Title VI, which has been construed as prohibiting discrimination on the basis of ethnicity and applied to anti-Semitism as well as other forms of discrimination on campus. And the complaint from the left end of the political spectrum, including major academic institutions such as Harvard, is that power to enforce an anti-discrimination law is being abused by trying to impose conditions on the university that violate free speech. That is an old argument that some of us on the left, but very few of us, have been arguing for a long time, going back to the Obama administration. And I know Obama has deep connections here, but he was no more perfect than any other president with respect to free speech. And the Biden administration revived it, taking another anti-discrimination statute, namely Title IX, prohibiting gender-based discrimination, and enforcing it on campus in a way that many of us argued seriously violated free speech by overly broadly defining the concept of sexual harassment. And believe me, sexual harassment does constitute a violation, a very serious violation of equal protection. But when you overly broadly define it, as the Obama administration first did, subsequently the Biden administration followed suit, as extending, again, I'm bringing up the topic of sexual expression that anybody found offensive or insulting, including because of disagreement on important policy issues about sex and gender, that was seen as a violation of Title IX. So, and let me just give you one other example, because I have to say, even within the ACLU, which did sue the Obama administration about the al-Awlaki killings, we go into why we lost it, why the courts made a mistake there. But even within the ACLU, we have trouble getting members to consistently adhere to neutral defense of free speech. Here in Chicago, I have to give the most famous or infamous example, the Skokie case from Skokie, Illinois, not very far from here. In the late 1970s, the ACLU successfully came to the defense of neo-Nazis' free speech rights to demonstrate in a community that they deliberately picked precisely because it had not only a large Jewish population, but many of them were Holocaust survivors. It was an easy victory in the courts of law because this principle of viewpoint neutrality that all of us have been talking about, even more importantly, the United States Supreme Court has unanimously for many decades said that is the bedrock principle of free speech. Government must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the idea, the content of the speech. But that was very unpopular in the court of public opinion, including within the ACLU, and we lost 15% of our members, card carriers who cared a lot about free speech. Same thing happened just 2 years ago. The ACLU came to the defense of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, not defending its policies any more than we're defending the Nazis' policies, but the principle that in this case, the Andrew Cuomo gubernatorial administration in New York put pressure on banking and financial services and insurance companies not to do business, not to provide basic services to the NRA, because the Cuomo administration disagreed with his policies about lack of gun regulation. The ACLU wanted to defend the NRA because this is such an important principle. We explained to dissenting members that, look, if the Cuomo administration can do this to the NRA, the DeSantis administration can do it to the ACLU or to Planned Parenthood. That wasn't good enough. The New York state-based affiliate in New York dissented from the position of the National ACLU. Fortunately, we won in the Supreme Court. And guess what? That is now a precedent that is being used in every lawsuit against the Trump administration by law firms and by universities, saying that government may not coerce either directly or indirectly private sector entities.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, well, first of all, let's give a round of applause to Clay and the rest of our panelists for their remarks. Thank you. So some great points brought up here. Thank you all for that material that we can work with. We believe we've got 4 panelists with legal backgrounds, or at the very least law degrees. So that's a fantastic resource for everyone here. I'd like to start with the more abstract component of our panel, which is the fight against censorship. And then we'll move into the future of American journalism. So looking at the fight against censorship, and of course, contest the premise if you seek to, but I don't think you necessarily will. I'd like to move to Jonathan first and ask you, people who are skeptical of free speech absolutism, as one might put it, will say, well, some ideas are so abhorrent and 99% of people know that they're foolish and they lead to negative outcomes. They can lead to people losing their property, losing their lives. Why would we let evil people, why would we let potentially stupid people impact our discourse when realistically we do know where it's going to turn out, which is that you may have some bad outcomes and ultimately those ideas are going to be left to the side in the long run. Why ought we enable that sort of conversation?
Well, that's an excellent question. I've often been called a free speech absolutist. It's not true, but I admit that my natural default is in favor of free speech, and I tend not to favor limitations on speech. I'm a dinosaur in that sense, in that I do believe in the old view that more speech is better and that good speech can overwhelm bad speech. But one of the things I say in The Indispensable Right is that history has shown that censorship hasn't worked once. It has a perfect failure rate. No censorship system in history has ever stopped a single idea or a single movement. It has a complete failure rate. And the question is why? And one of the things I argue in the book is that free speech is a human right. It's a natural right, something that is also maybe an outdated view among academics. But it's an important question to start with. That is, if you want to understand free speech, you've got to understand what being human is. And my argument has been that you cannot be completely human without free speech, without free expression. There's an innate desire to project part of ourselves into the world around us. Now, getting to your question, that means that we have plenty of people who are projecting a grotesque image. If you look at someone like Brandenburg, no one in their right mind, this is the famous individual behind the Brandenburg case, no one in their right mind would suggest that Leo Brandenburg's projection of himself in society had any positive aspects. He was a hateful, disgusting human being. He hated Jews, Catholics, he hated basically everyone but Brandenburg. And so it's easy to say, and this is one of the reasons I talk about in the book about what I call the functionalist approach, because we had this moment of clarity at the beginning of the American Revolution, that truly revolutionary moment, when the framers embraced free speech as a natural right. And it was lost during the Adams administration. And they went back to what I call the Blackstonian or functionalist view, and you're all familiar with it. It's a view that we protect free speech because it's good for democracy, and it certainly is good for democracy. But when that is your basis for free speech, it allows for endless trade-offs. It allows you to find some speeches good speech and some speech is bad speech. It allows you to say that some speech is good for the democratic process and some that is not. And in that sense, speech like those of Brandenburg really can easily be justified in limiting it. But Brandenburg's speech did have a value. It had a value to him. And we then have the ability to denounce him, denounce his speech as grotesque. That's not always an easy thing, because it means you have to allow people to speak that are saying things that are truly horrible, hateful. But that is the price of free speech. And when you look back at the censorship that we've gone through, which is an unprecedented censorship system in our history, and I think we are turning the corner on it. But last time I spoke at University of Chicago, in the front row were many of the signatories of the Great Barrington Letter. And after I spoke, I went and talked to many of them. Now, many of these scientists have been vindicated. They wrote against masks, the efficacy of masks. They wrote about the lab theory. They wrote about the lack of a need of shutting down our schools, against the 6-foot rule as being not scientifically based. All of those views have been largely vindicated. And I asked them, how many of you have been rehired? How many of you have been brought back to your associations? Not one. They're still persona non grata because they broke from the mob. And that's the true cost of censorship. We never had the debate that had occurred in Europe. Our allies didn't shut down their schools, and they have not experienced the terrible costs of censorship. Catholic schools here in Chicago and other cities did not shut down their schools, and they have not experienced those costs. We never had that debate because of censorship. We bore those costs because of censorship. And that's the true cost that no one associates with censorship.
Well, Jonathan's talking about 2 years ago, we had our Academia's COVID Failures Symposium here at the university, actually on the 9th floor of Rubenstein Forum. So if you're interested in more content there, you can find that on our YouTube page, as well as on the Academic Sanity Consortium's website. We were happy to have you there, and we're happy to have you here as well. As I'm the moderator, but I want to point out, Jonathan's correct that there was great censorship during the COVID era, and in fact, I was a junior in high school when COVID hit, and I come from the great state of California, and so we had a pretty strong regime of mandates in California, and so I was kicked out. I was in public school. They sent everybody home March 13th, 2020, and I was a junior, and I actually, in my senior year, went to a Catholic school largely because of this. My parents believed, well, the public schools are probably going to drop the ball, unfortunately, and so let's try to get our son a better education in his senior year. My senior year school, the Catholic school, was chomping at the bit to get back in person. I mean, that was really their number one priority. Legally, they were not able to get in person in any sense until April of 2021. So about 13 months before any students were allowed to go back in person. My peers who remained at the public school never went back to school. They never saw a day of in-person instruction again before they graduated high school. So I think the ramifications of censorship on our lives are very real. We talk about it in an abstract way, but it's important to understand that this stuff is very, very real. And so on that note, I'd like to turn to Cenk and then in turn Clay and ask you, you both, you say you've been canceled by different sides of the political spectrum, and so
congratulations.
Yes, thank you. And by the way, you should, if somebody's not trying to cancel you, I would suggest you're probably not speaking truth or saying anything very interesting at all. I actually take it as a badge of honor, regardless of where the cancel attempt is coming from.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so I'd like to ask you, what do you believe have been the most damning or destructive political as well as just tangible ramifications of censorship, specifically in the last, say, 5 to 6 years? And Cenk, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so first let me agree with a lot of the things that have been said on the panel and then challenge the other panelists and let's get interesting here. Number one, just a little bit more accurate, California was totally shut down except French Laundry. So that's where Gavin Newsom, the donors met without masks, et cetera, because everything's different for the donor class. They get everything they want. Second of all, let me agree with Clay on a couple of things. So my wife is Chinese, so my kids are obviously half Chinese. And somebody at their school said, "Oh, you guys eat bats?" Because of the wet market thing.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean,
now, you know, we at the Uygur household, we have thick skin. Okay, so I train, you know, we talk about getting past it. It's not a big deal. We don't make a giant, enormous deal out of it, but it's annoying, right? And so it's a good point you're making. And of all the different things you could be called, racist, bigot, et cetera, the one that shuts down speech the most, by far, in a landslide is anti-Semitic. If you're charged with being anti-Semitic, you're canceled to bejesus. Okay, for infinity and beyond, you are canceled. And so let's be realistic about that. And by the way, is there real racism in the country? Definitely. Is there real anti-Semitism in the country? Definitely. Okay. The question is, are you applying it in the right circumstances? So when a woman calls a 5-year-old black kid the N-word a couple of times, or a lot of times, that is racism. If you think that that is not racism, you don't understand the definition, right? But does that mean she represents all Trump voters? No, it does not mean that, right? So we've got to get right with, you know, being principled on all these issues. And you can't say, calling someone racist is cancel culture. But you're an anti-Semite. You better not criticize Israel. That's it. Fire them. Get them off the air, right? All right. Do we have principles or don't we have principles, right? So, okay, now on those, cancel culture, Megyn Kelly. And I've got a dozen of these examples from the Young Turks. But so she says blackface, she doesn't get why that's such a big deal that when she's on NBC, and they fire her. I said on there, I said, what are you firing her for? Like, do you know that the great majority of Americans have no idea why blackface is offensive, right? It is offensive, but they don't know why. So Al Roker was really upset, right? Okay, that makes sense. I know why he's upset. Why don't you have Al and Megyn go on air for an hour and talk about blackface and talk about the history of blackface, why it's offensive, how you can get past it, how we can heal. Instead, I fire you. Okay, well then nobody learned anything except to hate one another, right? And to be so nervous about what you say because you're going to get labeled something, you're going to get canceled something. You're going to get canceled and your whole career is going to be ruined. Look, Megyn's career wasn't ruined and my career wasn't ruined because we have new media now and things are different, right? But were they trying to ruin our careers? Definitely, right? And by the way, at MSNBC, I was a 6 o'clock host, got the highest ratings they ever got at 6 o'clock at that time. And they wanted to move me down to the weekends. And I remember talking to the head of MSNBC and saying, okay, I went through a laundry list. Did I do this right? Absolutely. This. I said, did I get the best ratings you ever got at 6 o'clock? Yes. I said, so what could I do at 6 in the weekends to get back into primetime if I already did everything right? And we sat there for the most awkward minute of silence that anybody's ever gone through. Okay, the reason I asked it that way is because the real reason they want to move me down to the weekends, and by the way, double my salary, even though they're moving me down, was because I was criticizing the Obama administration too much. And they had already warned me several times, remember who the home team is, okay? He even said outsiders are cool and wear leather jackets and ride motorcycles, but here at NBC we're insiders. I was like, are you trying to do a B-rate movie? Like, this is like a speech that comes out of a B-rate movie, right? I can't believe you're saying it. So, okay, now the challenge part. So, Trump, I don't like that people on Harvard and Columbia are criticizing Israel. Take away all their money for cancer research. What? Because of their speech? Because of a couple of students' speech, which you can't even prove was anti-Semitic. In fact, it wasn't anti-Semitic. In fact, one of the guys you arrested did a speech against anti-Semitism on national television.
By the way, anti-Semitism is protected speech.
It's also protected, of course. But in this case, the 3 people they arrested, there is no reason to arrest someone because they were labeled, quote unquote, anti-Semitic. But those 3 weren't even anti-Semitic, okay? Like, they just picked the worst possible case scenarios. I don't know if it's because they're deeply incompetent or they wanted to stretch the law as much as possible. If we can arrest Öztürk, who's a Fulbright scholar, who wasn't even involved in protests, didn't say anything about Hamas, didn't support them, didn't say anything anti-Semitic, but said an economic boycott of Israel, that'll send a clear message. If you defy Israel, we will end you. Okay? So if you're in favor of that policy, you hate freedom of speech. Just be honest about it, and we can move on. But you can't say I'm in favor of freedom of speech, but if you criticize another government, I'm going to cancel you for the rest of your life. Okay, so that's stone cold fact. There's no arguing it. Taking away from the money from Harvard and other places, let alone arresting and deporting those people. Unconscionable attack on free speech. And I'm glad to see independent shows like Joe Rogan's, who I thought would actually do the right thing, and everyone on the left said, you're nuts. No way Rogan and the independent guys are going to do the right thing. They're going to back Trump no matter what. And they were wrong. Rogan is saying it was wrong to arrest those people. He's correct. Okay, so I love when folks stick to principles. And then finally, as I said, Trump's attack against CBS, Washington Post, Facebook, etc. Oh my God, you hurt my feelings. Oh, your speech should be canceled. You owe me $10 billion. I'll shut down your broadcast if you ever dare defy me. I mean, on the 60 Minutes thing, it wasn't even him. It was Kamala Harris. They edited it because she can't stop talking. Okay, what are you supposed to do with an endless word salad, right? You're forced to edit it, and it's the most benign edit I've ever seen, and Kamala Harris lost. No, I want $10 billion. I'm going to cancel all of your speech. All right, so you never meant it. So I'm curious what you all think about Donald Trump's obvious violations of freedom of speech.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
because
sure, real quick, yeah.
One of the three important questions that you asked this panel, Christopher, was upon which constitutional values was the United States founded? And not everybody here has studied law, so I want to explain the legal basis for the important point that Cenk made about non-citizens having full free speech rights, or almost full free speech rights, to the same extent as U.S. citizens. There's one little caveat that I think results from a bad Supreme Court decision. But basically, the Constitution itself does not draw a distinction between citizens and non-citizens with respect to free speech. There are provisions in the Constitution that do expressly refer to citizens, but not the ones that deal with speech. The relevant word that is used is person. And so every person in this country, regardless of citizenship or non-citizenship, even regardless of legal, authorized or unauthorized presence, we've had unanimous agreement from the most left to the most right member of the Supreme Court that they are entitled to fundamental First Amendment rights. There's one old bad precedent from the McCarthy era as to the extent to which deportation may or not be imposed as a penalty. I think that was a very bad decision, but the fundamental principle is not debated.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you. And so I'd like to turn to Clay and along the lines of what has been said. What do you perceive really as having been particularly detrimental from government-imposed censorship, from mainstream media, and as Cenk referred, insider media imposed censorship? What have been the negative ramifications of that? And then in turn, we've seen, of course, a huge shift over to social media. I was just in front of a panel at a board meeting at the IOP, and I told them, none of us are watching mainstream media anymore. No one in my age. We had 4 students up there on that panel. Nobody said they watched TV in the last 3 months in terms of mainstream news. None of them. And that's that's not anomalous. That's entirely representative of our generation and the student body here, at least. So it's a massive transition. It's a massive shift. And so what have been those negative consequences? And then do you believe that any of those will be alleviated? Are you going to see any sort of positive shifts with this shift towards independent media?
So for people who don't know, I came out of the world of sports. And some of you may think that's crazy. How do we end up on this panel talking about censorship, First Amendment, all those things? COVID radicalized me in a significant way. And I'm curious, for those of you who are college-age kids here, I love your story. I mean, it's an awful one, but I appreciate you sharing it. You left in March of 2020, and the public school kids that you were with, I just want to reinforce this, never returned to school. You were a junior.
That's right.
Those kids never went back in California. I don't know how many that reflects for you out here, but I'm writing a new book about, I think we've underrated the impact of COVID, particularly on young men and young women in this country. Think about, I'm talking to YouTube here in particular, but I know for many of you out here too, but if you're older, if you're our age, imagine if when you were 16, before you went to your junior prom, before you finished your high school basketball season or your soccer season, you left and you never went back to high school. Think about how many profound life experiences you had at 16, 17, 18 years old. So this ties in directly with the question you asked, because I was doing national sports talk radio show. I was on, for those of you who are sports fans, I was on before Dan Patrick, before Colin Cowherd, Fox Sports Radio. Imagine you had 3 hours solo every morning, 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern, and in March of 2020, all sports stopped. And you had 3 hours to fill, 5 days a week, not one sporting event being played, March, April, May, June. That was my job. No one playing sports. My ratings skyrocketed. Why? Because I was saying what almost no one else would say: we have to put kids back in school. We have to start playing sports again. COVID is not a threat, based on the data, to young people in America, and we are doing a great, profound disservice to them by taking them out of school and sending them home for remote learning. And I said that as a kid who went to public school, K to 12, for a couple of reasons in particular. One, young boys are knuckleheads. We make awful decisions. Coaches and sports often help to put us in a position to make better decisions. I know we lost millions of young boys, young girls too, but young boys in particular. They never went back to school because they didn't get the grades to be able to play football or basketball or soccer or whatever, baseball, whatever sport they loved. Those kids are now going to all have profoundly worse life outcomes because of the choices that adults like me made for them. You should be angry. You should be furious. Do you know, second, who were the kids that were the most victimized by that? Poor kids, exactly right. Kids who had to go to public school like I did. Kids who were not able to get the resources to go to rich kid private schools, who didn't have daddies and mommies dining at French Laundry in the Napa Valley. The kids who could least afford to have their schooling taken from them had it taken from them. And you know who did it to them? The Democrat left-wing party that claims to care so much about equal opportunity and equity for everybody. That's why I say don't get locked into politics, because they failed at the most crucible moment in young people's lives to protect the young people that they claim to care about the most, and you hear very little talk about it right now. At my radio show and at Outkick, we were telling those stories. Facebook censored us directly, would not allow us to write stories sharing actual data about why kids needed to go back to school. They censored us from saying, hey, we need to examine where COVID came from. They censored us. I went and talked at my local public school board meeting from saying, hey, 6-year-olds don't need to have masks on in kindergarten and first grade, and it's actually restricting their ability to learn how to speak, because we learn how to speak by seeing lips move and judging people's faces. All of that was restricted. Now, the old school view is the key for speech you don't like is more speech, and ultimately you end up with a better outcome. Every person on this panel, I guarantee you, if you Google us, there are awful things that have been said about us. I wish people didn't say awful things about it. I wish that I didn't have to tell my kids, hey, be careful Googling dad, judge me based on being the dad in this household, not what, when you type in Clay Travis on Google, might pop up. But that is a small price to pay for being able to argue the things that I want to argue. So my concern, to your question, I think it's a profound one that everybody needs to think about, is as we limit the number of places that people get news, YouTube, where y'all are watching right now, took down an interview of Donald Trump that we did on my radio show because they didn't like what Donald Trump said. They took down an interview with Rand Paul as he was running for re-election in the Senate because they didn't like what he said about COVID on our show. Well, the entire purpose of people running for political office is to tell you what they think. The idea that YouTube, you guys, would decide, oh, we don't want a political figure's words to be widely distributed because we don't like what he's saying, is the antithesis of everything that is supposed to be represented in the Democrat process. So I want to respond to your point because I think it's a good one. I do think Elise Stefanik's questioning of Harvard, was it Harvard? It was, you guys will remember the
MIT,
three schools.
Penn.
MIT and Penn. What I would like for you to think, and this is what lawyers do, right? We change hypotheticals subtly to see whether or not you remain committed to the same principle. If on Harvard, MIT, and Columbia's campus, the KKK had been protesting, like the people who were opposed to Israel were protesting, would Harvard, MIT, and Columbia have allowed that protest to continue? Mm-hmm. I think the answer is hell no, okay? What I think is interesting, and this is where I think we would overlap, is I actually think the principle should apply whether it was the KKK ripping black kids on campus or whether it was the, whoever it is, the anti-Israel component, pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, whatever you want to classify them as, ripping Israel and Jewish students. The speech should not be restricted only for Jewish criticism, just like it shouldn't only be restricted for black criticism or Hispanic criticism or Asian criticism or Clay Travis is a Nazi criticism, right? You should have the same patterns. Now, there's a difference between taking over libraries and taking over quads, and content neutral policy should be applied no matter what. But I do think the lesson that was taken there is not the intelligent one to me from a principled perspective. It should have been, to me, well, if we're going to allow this type of speech against Jewish or Israel positions, then we should also allow it against black, Hispanic, Asian. That's not what was taken, right? They're pointing out the hypocrisy, but in so doing, they're actually arguing in favor of more speech restriction instead of more speech, which I think is the opposite of what we would aspire to have happen at a university campus.
I agree with everything Clay said, but there's one point that
We're going to go to Q&A,
Okay.
so just have your questions ready.
By the way, we
Let's
probably
hear
up here
from
could
you.
talk for 9 hours, right?
There's one really important legal point that I want to underscore, that we are criticizing YouTube, criticizing Facebook, criticizing the traditional media platforms for how they are using their First Amendment rights.
That's right.
Because as the Supreme Court held, and I agree, they have no First Amendment obligation as private sector entities to adhere to any First Amendment free speech principles. Those only bind the government. Conversely, as media platforms themselves, they have their own First Amendment rights of editorial discretion to decide which views to air, which speakers to air, and which not to. But we as consumers should protest and exercise our influence to try to dissuade them from these censorial perspectives. And more importantly, we need to create the kind of alternative platforms that both of you are exemplifying.
This is super important, and I would argue Outkick exists partly as a response to this. What she is saying is so important, but my concern on that is, if YouTube is the only place by and large that people go to watch video online, what do you do if you aren't able to be found there? That is profoundly important. And if Facebook and I give credit to Elon for buying Twitter and at least being in some way committed to free speech principles, although you can criticize the way that he's applied that, I think. But if there are only going to be, let's say, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, if there's only going to be 4 or 5 platforms that all of us are basically required to use, then the power that those platforms have when it comes to speech is arguably as important or more important going forward than what the government might try to do. And when the government interacts directly, as the Biden administration did, to try to restrict particular speakers they did not like, that becomes incredibly scary to me going forward.
And that does violate the First Amendment.
Yes.
If government is what is portrayed as an ostensibly independent decision by these social media companies is in fact the result of government pressure, here's where the NRA precedent comes in, that is treated as government action violative of the First Amendment.
That's one that I think the Supreme Court got wrong recently, because I do think the government can't, for those of you who don't know, the government can't do through a third party what it theoretically would be unable to do itself. I think the Biden administration did that with big tech companies. And the court, I don't think, really understands big tech well enough to comprehend, unfortunately. There's a great analogy. One of the challenges of having 9 people make decisions for all of us is we all age. And one of my law school professors said that she remembers, I think it was Souter, that she was a clerk for him. And if I got the judge wrong, I apologize. It's been 20 some odd years. But she said they were working late and they ordered pizzas. And the Supreme Court justice came in and looked at the pizza and he said, "Hey, what is that on the top of the pizza?" And she was like, "It's a pepperoni, Justice." And she thought it was just such an interesting analogy and metaphor going forward. This guy's deciding what the law of the land is, but his own life experience was such he had never seen a pepperoni pizza, right? We all have blind spots in our life, and as we age, we don't understand technology, I think, as well. Those guys would understand a newspaper and the New York Times v. Sullivan implications, I think, far better than they would a YouTube content restriction. So I think that is one reason that I think they whiffed there.
If there's anything that I like more than freedom of speech, it's pepperoni pizza.
Although a Souter proved to be a gateway meat to liberalism.
Excellent. Well, thank you folks so much. Let's turn to questions. We're going to prioritize students. So students who have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand, and then the attendants on the side will get to you.
Hey, all right, hi. Thank you guys for coming. Really appreciate the talk.
And please introduce yourself too.
Hi, I'm Marcus. Chris, really great moderation. It's great having you all here. I'm wondering, what do you guys think about the recent overturning of the Romanian election on the grounds of fake news by its alleged Russian TikTok accounts? I'm trying to be very neutral about the question because frankly I don't know how to take it. Just for people who don't know about this, the Romanian election was overturned and it was claimed that Russian bots filled TikTok with propaganda in favor of a pro-Russian candidate. So I'm wondering, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I hate it. So this whole idea that speech is election interference is lunacy. So it's lunacy when the Democrats, alluded to it. It's lunacy when the Republicans in the right wing do it. So Trump keeps claiming that everything that was said against him is election interference. No, that's called freedom of the press and freedom of speech. So grow up. There's people doing propaganda in our elections. Oh, you don't say? Huh. Well, that's new. Let's just cancel elections because of propaganda. Okay, so all right, let's list propaganda. When mainstream media says that all of our politicians are not crooks, when they take billions of dollars in donor money, and that the donors don't influence them, that's overwhelming propaganda. That is preposterous propaganda. No, they totally serve the donors. But you're not allowed to say that on cable news. So isn't that election, under that theory, that's election interference. You're interfering with people knowing the reality, which is that our politicians are generally crooks. And they almost all serve their donors. But you're not allowed to say that in mainstream media. By the way, it's a wild coincidence that almost all of the money in politics goes to mainstream media. I wonder if that money, those billions of dollars, is influencing their propaganda, right? You want to talk about foreign propaganda? Yeah, the Russians did a bunch of tweets in 2016. I think it was ineffective, and I don't think that it was coordinated. But yeah, they did do it. Okay, well, are there any other countries that might do propaganda in America? Probably not Israel. No way. No way. They would never do that. Violate the sanctity of American sovereignty. No, Israel's pure as the driven snow, has never done propaganda in America, right? But I can go on and on for all the
By the way, I think it's also important to point out, we have been lecturing Russia and other countries for interfering in our elections. Do you know the number one country that interferes in elections around the world? Us!
Yes.
You know, like, I mean, this whole idea, by the way, you know, $200,000 or whatever in Russian Facebook ads. I mean, I'm just here to tell you, if that's the best we spent billions of dollars on the election and that rigged 2016 for Trump to a couple $100,000. But it's important, I think, for American students to realize we are guilty when it comes to influencing political elections overseas, probably more than any country in the world, right? And so I think it's hard for us to claim we have clean hands on any election when our apparatus and our government entities and everything else are probably more active in global elections than any country in the world, which is one criticism of the United States that I think foreign countries can make and we should contemplate and consider when we're the one pointing out flaws.
Yeah, just to finish the thought, I totally agree with that, and that's actually inarguable. And speech does not rig elections. And even propaganda. Yeah, one person's speech is another person's propaganda.
Got it.
So I think what Israel is doing is overwhelming propaganda, but they would say, what do you mean? I'm just making my point. I'm saying that Israel is great, and we accidentally killed 50,000 people. They were all collateral damage, and they were all, and they all had it coming. And but that's not propaganda. And you all give me another $300 billion. That's not propaganda. That's just my opinion, and it is their opinion, right? That's not rigging elections.
And they would also say, Israel would, a lot of those 50,000 were Hamas soldiers. Now, what percentage of them is...
Yeah, they would say that. That's right. So of the 15 to 20,000 children murdered by Israel, none of them were Hamas, but they were all just an accident from the greatest army in the world. Anyways, but what is rigging elections, by the way, is the thing that rigs it most in America, money. So money rigs all of our elections, but when you go to talk about it, mainstream media cancels you. So how's that for ironic?
So because we've said how important disagreement is, I disagree with some of the points that are being made as facts, purported facts, but I agree with the really important principle here that the concept of propaganda or influence shouldn't be seen as inherently negative. It is the exchange of views, and we will disagree as to the accuracy or inaccuracy, credibility or lack of credibility. I would say, the kind of improper influence that governments can have on elections, sadly, the United States, among others, has had a track record of interfering through violence, not through providing information.
Let me also say things that I bet all four of us would agree, and you guys can disagree with me if you don't buy this, and I think it's important. The whole concept of fact-checking is often not related to fact at all, and almost immediately turns into opinion deciding, right? And so I hope that this whole, and I'm curious, I bet most of you would agree with me, the line between fact and opinion should be a very clear one. And for instance, if I said, hey, water freezes at 35 degrees, then it's fair for you guys to be like, hey, you're a moron, it's 32 degrees, right? That is an articulated, clear scientific fact. But what we have seen, I think, is the creep from fact checking to, oh, well, this is an opinion I'm uncomfortable with, and therefore I don't think it should go, and I'm using the guise of fact checking as a reason to censor it being shared.
Yeah, absolutely. Got it. Let's take one more question, and then we'll conclude here. Thank you all so much.
Hey, my name is Fabio. I'm a first-year student in computer science. There's been some talk about the influence of wealth on elections. I'm curious to know why that's different from free expression, just in a different means. It's a different vehicle. It still serves the same ends.
Yeah, this is one of the core parts of my book, Justice is Coming. And so in explaining how we lost the Democratic Party to corporate rule, I explain how we lost democracy to corruption and money in politics. So the Supreme Court made a series of disastrous decisions. Citizens United was actually shooting a dead horse. They killed a horse in 1976 and 78 with Buckley v. Vallejo and Bellotti, where they said, they didn't actually say corporations are human beings. Some Supreme Court clerk, which was a CEO of a railroad company, pretended that they said that. But that had been established that corporations are people, which is preposterous. It's lunacy. They're by definition not people, right? So then the Supreme Court in the 70s said, oh, since they're people, they have freedom of speech. And money is speech, so they have the right to spend unlimited money basically bribing our politicians. And Lewis Powell was not unclear about it. He wrote a memo to the Chamber of Commerce in 1971 before he was appointed to the Supreme Court, saying basically that big business should capture the courts with quote-unquote activist judges. And so he came on and he was an activist judge, and he pretended that all the things that I listed, which are all ridiculous. And I'm not the only ones who said that. The dissent, Byron White wrote, "This is a mortal blow to our democracy. We will not be able to gain control again. Corporations will spend unlimited money buying our politicians, and they'll totally destroy our democracy." He was 100% right. That's exactly what happened. Money is not speech. If that was true, then literal bribery is totally fine, according to that logic. What do you mean? I paid him $1 million to give me $1 billion contract, which is actually very similar to what Elon Musk is doing. I gave him $250 million. Now I'm going to get Golden Dome, which is $200, $300, $400 billion. But I'm just talking, right? And so, and in that case, it's a campaign contribution, which the Supreme Court says is legal. Supreme Court now says if you bribe a politician afterwards, that's just a gratuity. And that's also legal. And you can give them watches for Bob McDonnell, the case in Virginia, on and on. The Supreme Court loves corruption. They're the ones who created corruption in this country. Those activist judges have been a cancer in this country. And I don't mean it in like some weirdo, like hostile, aggressive way. Don't do anything to the justices. Okay, we fight back politically, rhetorically, constitutionally, and we need an amendment to go over the head of the activist judges right now. But money is definitely not speech. Otherwise, forget campaign contributions. You could literally go to a politician and go, here's $100 million. You don't serve the American people anymore. You serve me and only me. What? Money speech?
We started by saying how important disagreement is, so I disagree with every single word that impugned what the Supreme Court supposedly held. Some of the allegations about Justice Powell and so forth are accurate. The Supreme Court has never held, or even a single justice has ever asserted, money is speech or corporations are persons. Those are plainly nonsensical statements. What the Supreme Court has said, which gets propagandized, going back to that word, into this distorted caricature, actually makes a great deal of sense. Persons under the First Amendment, namely all of us, have not only a freedom of speech, but a freedom of association to band together in groups that we can constitute through various forms of organization, including unions, including for-profit corporations, not-for-profit corporations. And that is an important First Amendment right, because especially if you are voicing a controversial view, you might only feel comfortable doing it through the relative anonymity and the opportunity to amplify your voice in a group. And guess what is the first corporation in which the Supreme Court upheld that principle? Not that corporations are people, but people have the right to form a corporation in order to meaningfully exercise their freedom of speech. The corporation, the evil corporation that is responsible for corruption, according to my co-panelists, was the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, organized as most so-called public interest groups are as a not-for-profit corporation. The second nonsensical proposition that the Supreme Court never has subscribed to is that money is speech. Clearly, that doesn't make sense. But what 100% of the justices have agreed to, and by the way, that first proposition, 100% of justices have agreed to. They disagreed on other aspects of these cases, namely whether the particular regulations restricting expenditure of funds were justified or not. But on these two fundamental propositions, there is unanimity. And so the idea is that when government restricts how much money you can spend in order to convey a message, that is a restriction on speech, because it limits how widely you can disseminate your message. Suppose that your fine publication, and by the way, I was one of the initial subscribers as soon as it was formed.
We appreciate
Suppose
that.
there was a limit. You could only spend $1 to produce each issue. Obviously, that would restrict your ability to convey your message and the ability, the First Amendment right of audience members to receive that message. Now, I think there is very serious legitimate debate where the Supreme Court has split 5-4. Again, whether particular restrictions on the spending of money by persons who have organized in a corporate form are justified to promote various democratic goals. But let's dispense with these defamatory shibboleths about supposedly nonsensical rumor bases for the Supreme Court's
Well, I'd like to come.
We need to clarify one thing. I just need, as a point of information for people to know, the ACLU was on the wrong side of Citizens United.
The right side, some of us say.
They're the side of infinite corruption. And Nadine just admitted, corporations are people. They're a collection of people. And corporations should be able to spend unlimited money in politics. So thank you for proving my point.
Sure. Jonathan, I'd like you to weigh in here on the obvious disagreement. If a group of people who happen to have a lot of money want to promote a messaging campaign, is that speech, or are there issues with that?
Well, you have to feel sorry a bit for John Roberts that he's now being accused of his institution introducing corruption to America. I think that probably occurred probably about 30 seconds after we formed as a republic. But
well, that's fair.
The Citizens United is an interesting case because it divided the free speech community in an interesting way, I suppose. The free speech community was composed of not just free speechers, but also good government advocates that were largely aligned together in most cases. Citizens United then wedged that. A lot of the good government people went against the Citizens United claim. A lot of the free speech community went in favor of Citizens United. I was part of the latter group. I felt that the court got the decision correctly. The reason is that, first of all, one of the practical applications of Citizens United, and I did view, and I would ascribe to the remarks of my friend Nadine, is that this really, the associational speech issues there were tremendous. And the reason is that, and this is part of the reasons I'm friends on the other side, and I have many friends on the other side. When we'd have debates about Citizens United, including when it was before the court, often struggled with one question I would ask, and that is, putting aside this question of free speech, corporations, and persons, how do you distinguish between corporations that, for example, are non-for-profit? Corporations, after all, unions are corporations. The Sierra Club's a corporation. Yes, General Motors is a corporation. A corporation is a collection of individuals joined together for financial or political or social reasons. And you can't say, well, we should just say that non-for-profits can engage in political contributions. That doesn't work either, because then you'll just have these corporations create non-for-profits, so it's not a particularly clever idea. So you do face this decision that you have to make. And it is true that many of us in the free speech community, while certainly sharing views about the corrosive influence of money on politics, our default lies with free speech. To me, all these corporations are large gatherings of individuals who amplify their voices by joining together and contributing to those causes, whether they're unions or whether they're citizens united. I think that the onus is on the other side to tell us where this path takes us, that once you start to say, if Citizens United came out the other way, to me, you're on a slippery slope. I don't think you could have found terra firma if they went the other way, okay, now we can start to restrict this type of speech. In fact, in Citizens United, there were powerful briefs submitted and records submitted as to this government agency distinguishing between films. You had the film on Hillary Clinton, which was viewed as political, and then you had other films that seemed to favor the Democrats, that was viewed as protected and not to be restricted. That's the slippery slope that you find yourself on. In many ways, free speech is a leap of faith. It may be the greatest leap of faith in the United States Constitution. It's a difficult one. And I would submit that we are in the middle of a crisis of faith. What it demands from us is to accept the speech of others while we may disagree with it. That was the ultimate example of Skokie as a case. But it does require a leap of faith. And I think the reason we have a crisis of faith today is that people don't understand the Constitution was ultimately a covenant not between individuals and the government, but with each other. That is, we agreed as individuals that we would fight for each other even when we disagreed. And I think that's where the crisis is. That's part of the age of rage. It gives you this license to say and do things you would not ordinarily say or do. It's all around us. And we see it all the time on both sides. And what people don't get about rage, besides the fact that it robs us of reason, is that people like it. They won't admit it. They like it. And it's contagious. But the First Amendment is one of those questions as citizens that we have to transcend the rage. And we have to make tough choices. We have to support the Brandenburgs. And yes, we have to support the Citizens United, because that is ultimately speech.
I got to address that. So number one, I agree with Nadine and Jonathan that it is an interesting intellectual debate. Okay, so in fact, right after Citizens United passed, we had Glenn Greenwald and Professor Larry Lessig from Harvard on to debate it. And it was a really spirited, interesting debate, and you should go back and check that out on YouTube. And so I don't want to shut off that kind of intellectual debate. And we should talk about it as till the cows come home. Okay, that's speech. Money is not speech. Money is not speech. That's a lunatic position. Okay, so right now, Young Turks are a corporation. All right, maybe we should test this. Why don't they just go bribe a bunch of politicians? They'll take it in a second, right? And then go to the Supreme Court, go, what? What? Money speech? I'm a beloved corporation. Corporations have way more rights than human beings. So now I get to bribe anyone, right? I bet you they'll say yes, because they love corruption. They love it. So this idea, look at this discussion of how we can have a slippery slope. But Jonathan, you know that everybody who goes to law school knows a slope slides in both directions, right? You want to talk about a slippery slope. Byron White said, we'll have a slippery slope that if you allow corporations to contribute to political campaigns, they will, since they have way more money than everyone else, they will eventually purchase all of our politicians. And that slope slid all the way down, and he was 100% right. And now our politicians serve the donor class like dogs. So, okay, here, let's talk about how pharma talk to our politicians, okay? Big Pharma is the drug companies. It was just a collection of human beings who happen to work for drug companies. And they just all happen to believe that all of competition should be limited. And you should not even be able to negotiate drug prices. In a free market, no competition is allowed. No drug prices can be negotiated. That's not a free market. That's some sort of weirdo corporate communism, right? It's corporate cronyism. It's the slippery slope sliding exactly to where Byron White said it was going to slide. And now we pay more than any other country by a landslide for drugs because Big Pharma bought All of our politicians, Obama said he was going to get rid of it, Bush started it, Biden, Trump, they all said they were going to get rid of it. They all got bribed by corporations, a collection of people who happen to care about that particular corporation. And they did it with a lot of persuasive speech, as in, here's $100 million, do as I tell you, dog. Okay.
Let me jump in here for just 1
Hear
sec.
from Clay here.
Let me just jump in for 1 sec, because I think this is really kind of instructive. Do you know who would agree with a lot of what he just said? Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is in the Trump cabinet.
That's true.
It's true.
So what is going on there? And I think it's fascinating, because I happen to be a very much obviously in favor of free speech, but also think this is an example of one that we failed on. You know, there's only 2 countries in the world that can basically have unregulated prescription drug advertising, us and New Zealand. If you watch, and none of y'all do because you're all young, but if you watch Fox News and you watch MSNBC and you watch CNN, do you know who the top advertisers on many of those programs are? Prescription drugs. Do you think that might have influenced the coverage of the COVID shot, which is basically worthless, but our tax dollars gave hundreds of billions of dollars in profits to Moderna and Pfizer and whoever, Johnson & Johnson? Do you think maybe that might have had a little bit of an impact? And the reason why I think it's significant is this is where you create really dynamic and different ways of conversation going. That RFK Jr., a lifelong Democrat, his probably, if you asked him, I think one of his signature issues would be we shouldn't have prescription drug advertising on television, because his argument is that leads people who otherwise don't need those prescriptions to go to their doctor and say, I need Celebrex or whatever the hell it is. And the result is, and this is me on a soapbox, I think we probably have 75% of our medical treatment that we have in the United States is worthless in terms of actually making us healthier. That's my personal opinion. I think I should be able to argue it. Now, the question you asked, which is a really good one, and I think it becomes so fascinating, is what does it lead to? You know what Kamala Harris spent in 90 days? $1.5 billion on her presidential campaign. She spent way more than Trump.
Oops.
Lost, right? But what does it lead to? You can't get $1.5 billion unless you're independently, insanely wealthy. So what we create is a system where you have really wealthy people who want to run, or you have people who aren't wealthy but have to beg wealthy people for money so they can run. That is our system, whatever you think about it. And that is the world in which we create the dynamics at play, which is you don't get billions of dollars, much of it from big business, without making a lot of promises in the process, which is something that the American political process, Democrat, Republican, Independent, the money is certainly a huge part of the way the election outcome comes. But Kamala spent more and lost to Trump. I would argue that's the marketplace of ideas. Trump had better arguments than Kamala did. I think others would disagree.
I think we've run out of time, and I respect the audience plus my
Let's have 30
schedule.
seconds from you and 30 seconds from Jonathan.
Okay.
This is a great panel, I'll just say.
We've talked about the importance of disagreement and open-mindedness, so please keep open minds. These are extremely controversial, debatable points. But even assuming completely hypothetically, for the sake of argument, that all of the horrible dangers and evils of free speech that have been argued for here were true, that does not justify censorship. Censorship is only justified if the potential harm from the feared speech is greater than the potential harm of investing government officials, politicians, with the power to decide, is this particular campaign speech too dangerous? Is this particular advertisement too dangerous? And as Jonathan has already alluded to, history shows that, guess what? Every administration that has had that power, they had it under the so-called fairness doctrine. That sounds great, right? Every single one of them, Democrat and Republican, guess what? Speech of their political opponents or supporting their political opponents was what was deemed to be dangerous. So I come back to Winston Churchill's famous aphorism about democracy being worse than every other, except for every other form of government. Free speech is dangerous and harmful, but it is much less dangerous, much less harmful than empowering the government to take these decisions away from we the people.
I suddenly feel like when I saw the last episode of The Sopranos and screamed at the TV, you can't end that way.
I love that.
And I just want to throw one flag up about the narrative involving bribery and speech. We see something like that in the free speech community where people often challenge me and say, well, you're a free speech absolutist. We have to regulate speech. After all, they could claim that child pornography is speech, that fraud is speech and stuff like that. It's a false narrative because yes, you can use speech to commit crimes, but you're prosecuting the crimes. And for example, we did censor, all the social media companies censored things like child pornography, human trafficking, because they were censoring the conduct. Yes, you use speech to commit that underlying conduct. In the same way, it's just saying that money means bribery. It's like objecting that if you use a car, you must be in favor of carjacking because cars are used in carjackings. The fact is that yes, money can be used for good or bad purposes, but the point of Citizens United, I think, is still more profound than that. That yes, we join together to amplify our voices. And sometimes we do that for political or social or economic purposes. There's always a tendency, an inclination, a desire to say, well, those purposes are not acceptable. Your motivations are not acceptable. This group over there needs to be limited where this group is not. Down that path lies madness. We've seen how that happens. Free speech isn't a free fall in Europe. Many of us, three of us were in Berlin for the World Forum. And it was a chilling experience to see what is happening in Europe. That wave has reached our shores. We're it. We have to fight for free speech now. And we have to fight on the brightest of bright line rules. And it's fallen to us. And it is our greatest legacy, but it is a dangerous pretense to believe that because it is still here that it can't be lost. And so I would encourage you to think deeply before you start to make those trade-offs on free speech.
Yeah. Well, what a panel. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
That was really interesting. Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.
Money's not speech.
We're going to take a 10-minute break, so it's 11:27. Let's come back at 11:37 for the next panel. And there's actually a snack over in the lobby or in the foyer. Thank you.